Danny Truth Magnified.
Space, the final frontier.
I love Star Wars. I love Star Trek. I love sci-fi in general. But we have to question everything around us. And we know that the main source of our concept for space comes from these space agencies. And we've got space agencies all over the world, but there is no bigger space agency than NASA. They say there's been about $650 billion invested into NASA alone. And that's more money than what's been invested into any other space agency in the world combined. And of course, the whole idea of the space race was to be the first country to actually get a man into space. And as far as they tell us, NASA was the very first space agency to put a human being on the moon and to plant that American flag into an object in space. So when we think of the epitome of space exploration, when we think about space travel, and the most credible source of information pertaining to space, we're going to think of NASA. And NASA gets a lot of flack for not being a trustworthy organization. You got a lot of people who just do not trust what they tell us. You know what they say, NASA stands for never a straight answer. But is that distrust really validated? Well, we're all pretty familiar with the NASA logo. And they say each part of that logo represents a different aspect of space or a different aspect of aerospace, because you got the logo itself being circular like a planet, and you got the stars within that circle. You got that whirling line going around the A and the S, which represents an orbit in space. And then you got that red V shape, which is supposed to represent the wing of a spaceship. But does it really look like a wing? I mean, everything else on that NASA logo is pretty easily recognizable. But that V shape is kind of just the one thing that kind of just like stands out from everything else. You know, like, why is that there? Again, they say it's supposed to represent a wing, but when you compare it to an actual wing on a spacecraft, it doesn't really fit. But to me, there is one thing that seems to match this part of the logo, and that's the tongue of a snake. I mean, if you take that part of NASA's logo and you compare it to the tongue of a snake, it looks just like a forked tongue of a serpent. The two sections of that forked tongue with the tongue sticking out at the base. It looks pretty much identical, even with that color being red. Again, matching the most common color of most snake tongues. And then what's crazy is that if you look at the logo of a good majority of all the other space agencies around the world, you can see this same symbolism included in their logos. This thing that, again, is supposed to represent a wing, it's looking very similar to the tongue of a snake. And they all seem to incorporate it in different ways, but no matter how it's inserted in, it's always inserted into these logos of these space agencies. It seems to be like the one common denominator tying them all together. And again, it just so happens to look like the tongue of a snake. And for whatever reason, they're all including it in their logos. And again, we know out of all of these space agencies, NASA is the most prevalent. They are the front runners of space exploration. And it seems like everybody else is pretty much following their lead. And we know when you're talking about a snake or a serpent, by definition, you're talking about being secretive or being deceitful, misleading somebody and telling lies. And NASA stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And NASA is actually a Hebrew word. And in Hebrew, it means to lift, carry, or to take. But there's also a word in Hebrew, Nashah, which is extremely close to NASA. And that word means to beguile or to deceive. And again, we know that to be a serpent or a snake also means to beguile or to deceive. And again, we've got something that looks very close to a snake's tongue on the logo for NASA. But then the question is there any proof of deception from NASA? This is where we get into the controversy, because you got a lot of people that question, did we really land on the moon? Remember, right around this time in the 1950s, you had the whole space race between the Soviet Union and the US to try to become the first country to put a human being into space. And of course, the United States was the first and only country to do that with the Apollo missions. And so, of course, this was a huge deal. And even after the Apollo missions, when you look back at it, they were already talking about sending human beings back to the moon, to Mars, and all different types of manned missions into outer space. But of course, since that last Apollo mission over 50 years ago, not only have they not sent another human being to the moon, but we haven't even had another human being leave low Earth orbit, which is pretty much still staying within Earth's atmosphere, staying within Earth's gravitational pull. In the last 50 plus years, we have not had another human being go beyond that. And so you got a question, why is that? Well, all of the astronauts, astrophysicists, people working in aerospace today are saying that the reason they have not left Earth orbit in the last 50 years is because they have not quite yet figured out how to safely get human beings beyond the Van Allen radiation belts. And of course, the Van Allen radiation belts are pretty much what it sounds like. These bands of highly active radiation that literally surround the Earth. And supposedly, the higher you go up into these belts, the more intense the radiation gets. And they're saying that fully understanding how these belts work and how they would affect human beings is what is preventing them from leaving Earth orbit. But again, apparently, they were able to get human beings beyond these radiation belts over 50 years ago. And not just once, but over 6 times. Because you had 6 separate Apollo missions where they sent human beings to the moon. And again, this was over 50 years ago, when you would think they would have had a lot more inferior technology. Now, the thing is, they did discover the Van Allen belts about 5 years prior to the first manned Apollo mission. But the thing is, they didn't even really understand the belts then.
This is the first weather image ever transmitted from a satellite. Recorded by a scanning device in Explorer 6, orbiting 17,000 miles above Earth. It indicated cloud cover over a broad area in the Central Pacific. This technique will permit man to track and predict the movement of great destructive storms. Satellites also tell man about strange forces and events in space. In the course of probing cosmic rays, American satellites made possible the most significant finding of the space age, the discovery of the vast and complex regions called the Van Allen radiation belts. Below about 400 miles, the first and third American satellites found the amount of cosmic radiation that scientists expected. But farther out, the satellites found radiation so intense that their Geiger counters were temporarily saturated. Measurements by a later satellite showed no tapering off as far out as 1,400 miles. Instead, the radiation seemed to double in intensity every 60 miles of altitude. Late in 1958, space probe Pioneer 3 reached out 66,000 miles and recorded 2 peaks in radiation intensity, one at 2,000 and another at 10,000 miles. Pioneer 3 also traced out the outer region of the radiation. These findings led scientists to believe that two great zones of radiation encircled the Earth under the influence of the Earth's magnetic field. Space probe Pioneer 4 confirmed these findings and recorded fluctuations in the farthest regions of the outer zone. New details are being added to the picture of this highly complex region that surrounds our planet. Its discovery is a most important step in sounding the endless sea of space.
So yeah, when they first discovered these belts, all they really knew was the further you ascended away from Earth's atmosphere, the more intense this radiation would seem to get. And it seemed like there was two layers to this thing, because the level going higher up was way more intense than the one at the start. And so they figured it must be two separate belts of radiation creating this thing. But again, they could only study it but so far, because the Geiger counters couldn't even handle the amount of radiation that they started to experience as you kept going further and further into this thing. And so these radiation belts were mostly still a mystery. And it wasn't until 50 years later, when they were able to launch the Van Allen probes even higher into the belts, that they realized there wasn't just two belts making this thing up, but actually three belts. And that third belt was even more lethal and even more saturated in radiation than the second. And it was at this point that even NASA came out and was referring to this thing as an impenetrable barrier in space, meaning that this thing was impossible to go through. There was just no way that any organic matter was going to make it through this wall of radiation. And even then, they still didn't have a clear understanding of this thing, because another 7 years after that, they realized that this thing didn't just have one belt, two belts, or even three belts, but that this impenetrable barrier was actually made up of 4 belts. And again, that the highest belt, that fourth belt, had even more intense and more deadly radiation than the rest. And they're still perplexed by this thing. They still haven't gained a true understanding of how this thing works, or how to properly shield human beings or anything organic from it. And you got so many astronauts, astrophysicists, people working in aeronautics and in aerospace saying the same thing over and over again, that they cannot figure out how to safely get human beings beyond the Van Allen radiation belts. And that because they cannot figure that out, no human being is going anywhere beyond Earth orbit.
The Human Research Program works to project, assess, and solve the problems that astronauts have in space. Specifically for radiation research, the Human Research Program works to predict and mitigate the health effects of space radiation on astronauts.
There's two parts of radiation we have to protect the crew from. One is a solar particle effect, where there's a solar storm and these energetic particles stream out. Fortunately, we know how to protect the crew from that. We put them into a shelter that's shielded by lots of water. And actually, they're very short duration, hours to days at most. They can come out and continue with their journey. That's the one aspect of radiation we know how to protect against. The other, which we really don't have a firm handle on, is galactic, cosmic rays. These are highly energetic particles that come from all over the galaxy towards the solar system and Earth. You can't shield against these. They're so energetic, they rip right through all metals, all plastic, all water, and all cellular material. And as they rip through these materials, little electrons and protons pull off of them, and you end up getting a cascade effect of radiation throughout the materials. And sometimes going through certain materials causes a worse radiation environment for the crew that had gone through other materials.
The effects of long duration missions on humans, it depends on obviously how long these are. Right now, NASA considers long duration missions are about 6 months on the International Space Station. Because we're in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station, and we're not going near the poles, the radiation is a concern, but it's not what I would consider life-threatening concern. You do get a higher dose than if you were here on the ground, but from a significant point of view, I think a astronaut can basically do at least 2 missions before there's any concern of saying, hey, do you think they've received too much radiation during their lifetime? And of course, we know that radiation basically can cause cancer if exposed to it too much. And so those are the concerns that we have as scientists. Now, the big thing is, or the bigger concern is, when we go beyond low Earth orbit. In other words, we say, okay, now we're gonna go ahead and go to the moon for a long duration, or we're gonna go to Mars for a long duration. Now we don't have the protection of the poles, because most of the radiation that approaches the planet, because of the poles, gravitate to the poles. And so around the equator, there's not that much of a concern. Now when you go beyond low Earth orbit, now you're more susceptible to getting high energy radiation as a dose to the individual. And so those are the type of technologies that we need to start developing that protects our astronauts from receiving these high doses of radiation once we're out of the confines of low Earth orbit.
So again, you got to ask the question, if they still haven't figured out how to make it past the Van Allen radiation belt safely right now, then how did they make it past those belts with much more inferior technology and a lot less understanding of the belts over 50 years ago? Well, let them tell it. They say that all 6 times that the Apollo astronauts rocketed through the Van Allen belt, what got them through those belts was pure luck. Literally, they say the Apollo astronauts had good luck on their side that somehow miraculously got them through these belts. Because even without a lot of knowledge of the belts, they somehow figured out the one and only way to safely maneuver around the belts. And the way that they explain it is that they worked their way around the belts through one of the weaker parts where the radiation wasn't as strong, and basically punched their way through the worst part of the radiation near the top at this breakneck speed that protected them from the effects of this radiation. Because with the way that they angled it and with the speed, the Apollo astronauts only got about as much radiation as you would get from an X-ray. And again, this was nothing short of a miracle, because they pulled this off without fully understanding the belts, and they were able to repeat this same miracle 6 times in a row. But again, if they did it then, why can't they do it now? I mean, you would think that they would still have the technology, that they would still have the shuttlecraft and all the data from the original Apollo mission. But that's not the case, because NASA actually says that they not only lost the technology and the equipment associated with Apollo, but that they also lost all the subsequent data connected to the Apollo missions. And that this is why the Apollo missions can never be duplicated again.
8, 7, 6.
They can put a man on the moon.
1. Booster ignition.
But they can't keep track of the equipment they use to do it. That's according to NASA reports obtained by the I-Team. Kennedy Space Center employees report just last year, nearly $500,000 of high-tech items simply vanished.
Something's broke in the system.
Suzanne Padone works for Inventory Management Solutions. Companies hire her to keep track of their inventory and make sure nothing falls through the cracks. We showed her what we found at NASA.
It appears that there isn't really a process working year after year, and it's probably going to continually get worse.
Here's another one. 11 radios lost. Price, $35,000. And a high-tech wave reflectometer went missing in 2008. That's another $18,000. NASA officials say they're aware of the problem.
We need to do a better job of keeping track of it, obviously, and we know that. We want to do a better job of it.
NASA argues they're losing mostly old and unused items. They also say most of it isn't really lost. It's likely still at Kennedy, somewhere.
Could be something that was supposed to be listed in this place, stored on a shelf to be excised. It's not where it's supposed to be. It gets listed as missing.
Former NASA employee Keith Cowing says NASA's losing more of its technology because the space shuttle program is ending and the agency's facing cutbacks. But he believes NASA shouldn't worry too much about lost equipment.
Don't spend your time tracking computers and not launching spaceships. I mean, you need to be launching spaceships.
But NASA is still a government agency, so all that lost equipment still adds up to $500,000 the taxpayers paid for.
The general public is not going to be happy if they know assets are missing, and it's not getting addressed.
If you want to see what else NASA has lost over the last 3 years, you'll find a complete listing on our website, abcactionnews.com/iTeam. Michael George, ABC Action News.
Then you got the astronaut Don Pettit that literally came out and said, look, we want to go back to the moon, but we didn't lose the technology. We actually destroyed the technology.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
So whatever the case may be, whether they lost the technology or they destroyed it, NASA is saying it doesn't exist anymore. And since it would be too difficult to rebuild or duplicate, we will never see anything quite like what we saw with the Apollo missions ever again. But what did we see? Did we actually see the Apollo craft land on the moon? If you talk to a lot of people who were alive during that time, most people seem to remember sitting in front of the TV and watching the Apollo craft rocket into outer space and land safely on the moon, live on national television. But when you go and look back at each individual broadcast of the Apollo flight on each television network that it was aired on, you're going to see that there was no live footage of Apollo ascending into space at all. Every single live broadcast of the Apollo flight through space was animated. CBS, ABC, all these major networks broadcast animated simulations of the Apollo craft rocketing through space and landing on the moon, with live sound bites of the Apollo astronauts in the background. And the reason they said they did this was because they didn't have the capability at the time to broadcast images from beyond low Earth orbit back down to Earth. So using these animations was the only possible way to broadcast this event to the world. And again, everybody seems to have been in such awe of the idea of what was happening, human beings landing on the moon, that they didn't even notice and don't remember even now that all of this was broadcast in an animated form. But even Buzz Aldrin, one of the first men to walk on the moon, is saying what you're remembering is not what you actually saw. What you saw was animation.
But let's talk about this, because this is fascinating. I remember very clearly, I think anybody who was alive at the time does. I remember my parents waking me up, and we went down and we watched you guys land on the moon.
No, you didn't.
What?
Because there wasn't any television. There wasn't anybody taking a picture. You watched animation. So you associated what you saw with...
I have very hazy memories.
Yeah, I know.
Well, no, what we saw was we all were gathered around the old curved top radio and listened.
Talking about, how many feet we were going to the left and right, and then I said, contact light, engine stop.
It was
and
exciting.
A few other things, and then Neil said, Houston, Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed. Man, how about that?
That was very exciting.
Not a bad line.
Yeah, yeah.
10%. Ignition 10%, 10% throttle, I suppose that is, Wally?
Yes, it'll be programmed up as they get closer. We're in really good shape again.
Action thing is a green bay, close me. Roger. Great. 10 minutes to the touchdown.
That's it, I got it. Radar lock.
They're at about 35. Altitude lights out. 35,000 feet high now. Crowds around this country and all over the world are watching this, listening to these communications.
Altitude now 21,000 feet, still looking very good.
This is the International Arrivals Building, Kennedy Airport.
800 miles an hour forward speed,
a
about
big
102
display
miles an hour
board there.
vertical speed.
Velocity
down now to 1,200 feet per second. Looking great,
this is Disneyland in California. That high
We're
gate.
now in the approach phase, everything looking good.
They're inside the high
Altitude
gate.
5,200 feet.
5,200 feet, less than a mile from the moon's surface.
35 degrees. 35 degrees, 750, coming down to 23. 700 feet, 21 down, 33 degrees.
Oh, the data is coming in beautiful.
100 feet, down at 19. Step down. 9 forward. Good. 75 feet. There's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. Hello. 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 20, down a half. 30 seconds forward. Good. Ready? Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. Host control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm
We're
off.
home.
413 is in.
Man on the moon.
We copy you down, Eagle. Houston,
Oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Ooh. Oh, boy.
Thank you. You're looking good here.
Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute. After I'm on, take care of the descent. I'll get this stuff prepared.
Wally, say something. I'm speechless.
I'm just trying to hold on to my breath. That is really something.
And this is how it was for every single Apollo mission. Live broadcasts of animated spaceships traveling through space and landing on the moon. This whole sequence was broadcast through animation. And it wasn't until the actual moonwalk that we would actually switch over to real live video footage. And of course, with Apollo 11, we got that historic moment of the very first human being planting his feet down on the lunar surface and walking on the moon. And of course, this whole thing was broadcast live. Billions of people watching Neil Armstrong step out onto the moon. But think about it. How did they get that shot of Neil Armstrong climbing out of the lunar module and making those first steps onto the moon? They say that they actually had a camera strapped to the side of the lunar module before Apollo even left the ground. If this camera was already strapped to the lunar module before Apollo even left the ground, why not give us a live feed of the lunar module in space and making that initial moon landing? Because we got it later. They released that footage years later. Even if the live feed was a little distorted, it would still be better than animation. But again, they say it was technologically impossible at the time to produce a live feed of them in space and a live feed of them landing on the moon. But we do have the moonwalk, which took about 6 hours after they landed to air live. So there was like a 6-hour delay between the landing and the live feed. And we never actually saw the liftoff of Apollo 11 live on TV because, again, apparently at the time they didn't have the technology to broadcast that moment. And then with Apollo 12 through 15, we got animated liftoffs. And it wasn't until Apollo 16 and 17 that they were able to finally broadcast Apollo's liftoff from the moon live on national television. And I mean, when you look at these liftoffs, something just seems off. Even the most diehard Apollo fanatics will admit that this just looks really strange. And just being blunt, it just does not look real. Whether it isn't real or whether it is real. But Apollo 17 marks the final Apollo mission. And, you know, each one of these separate Apollo missions had their own individual moonwalks. And during each one of these moonwalks, the astronauts explored the lunar surface and collected moon rocks. And when they came back from each Apollo mission, they brought these moon rocks back with them. And a lot of the moon rocks were handed out to different presidents, dictators. Some were donated for research, but ultimately NASA and the president at the time, Nixon, gave these moon rocks out to all these important and high-ranking people. And it wasn't before long that they realized that just about all these moon rocks, hundreds of moon rocks, went missing. Literally just vanished. None of the world leaders know where they went. It's like these moon rocks have literally just disappeared. So with no explanation, the only tangible objects brought back from the moon missions are suddenly gone.
Alan Bean was a Texas native and was among the Apollo crews who brought moon rocks back to Earth. But decades later, hundreds of those rocks are missing. Jason Wheeler introduces us to a moon rock hunter in tonight's WFAA Original.
We'd like to share a piece of this rock with so many of the countries throughout the world.
Astronauts gathered,
And we're taking a piece of the rock itself.
hundreds of pounds
Okay, I got that piece inside too.
of rock
Want me to get some more? Yeah, a little more.
on that final mission
Here I am, folks, in the middle of a boulder field.
to the surface of the moon
It's the old boulder rolling trick.
and 5 lunar excursions before it.
I think we better leave it at that.
The rocks
2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
were brought back
Stowed in the spacecraft, almost 250 pounds of the moon.
to the third rock from the sun. Hundreds of the fragments were gifted to states and countries.
To actually have a piece of another body in the heavens, the moon, that we actually went to and a human being actually picked up, that's incredible.
But there was an incredible failure, too,
We didn't track them.
says Texas attorney Joe Goodhines.
And we were giving these moon rocks to some of the worst dictators in the world, like Gaddafi. And big surprise, they were disappearing.
After a career as a NASA investigator,
To some individuals in this society, those moon rocks are priceless. And if I could kick in a door and grab that moon rock and return it and put it in a museum, how many people think I would do that? Anybody? Oh, okay.
he gave his students the toughest of assignments: find missing moon rocks.
Africa, most of them are missing. Europe, some of them are missing.
To figure out where in this world dozens more rocks from that world disappeared to. Jason Wheeler, Channel 8 News.
We're talking moon rocks this morning.
Rocks. Yeah.
So they were brought during the Apollo missions back to Earth, and what happened?
Well, it was the Apollo mission, so the 5 missions that actually landed on the moon, and the Apollo 11, the famous one with Neil Armstrong, one small step for man, and they brought back samples, about 800 pounds of them, so about 300 kilograms or so of them. They gave them out. Yeah, they vanished. I mean, so what happened basically is Richard Nixon, as part of his goodwill tours, would say...
You're not blaming Nixon.
No,
You're
not
saying
blaming
Nixon stole them, are you?
No, he didn't steal them.
Okay.
He gave them away. He gave them away
Okay.
as souvenirs to all the heads of states from every country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened is they've lost them.
What's the value of these rocks? Are they just souvenirs?
There's scientific value to them. I mean, they tell us about what the moon is composed of. It's not cheese. It's
I knew it.
Knew it.
Okay, yeah.
So it tells us about the composition, the evolution of the moon. I mean, there's still controversies. People are still discussing. So even in science books, we don't know how the moon was formed.
Did we actually land on the moon? I thought that was all staged in a hoax. Okay, I'll stop talking about
we have landed on the moon.
Okay,
we have these rocks to prove it, and
exactly. Or we had the rocks to prove it. How do you tell? Is there a way to tell moon rock from non-moon rock? Even if we find these rocks, we go, oh yeah, here's your moon rock.
That's the thing. I mean, it's very difficult because according to the theories and what the Apollo missions found from the geological work that they did, they're Earth rocks, because it turns out the moon is part of the Earth. What the going hypothesis is that a large meteor hit the Earth, and part of the Earth, a chunk of the Earth, ripped off, and that's our moon. So it is Earth, rocks we have there, but the way we figure out the difference is they're much older. They're about 4.5 billion years old compared to the surface rocks we have on Earth, which are about 3 billion or so. So that's the way to distinguish them, but those tests are not easy to do.
I can imagine that.
So all these moon rocks have just mysteriously disappeared because apparently NASA failed to track them. And nobody has an answer as to where these things could have gone. There's a lot of speculation about them being stolen, sold on the black market, and basically just bouncing around from place to place. But there's so many locations where these moon rocks have literally just vanished. There are a couple of places that still possess these moon rocks. And one of those places is the Netherlands. They had their moon rock displayed in the Dutch Museum, and it wasn't until 40 years later that they finally decided to pull this thing out of the display case and to run tests on it to basically see what this moon rock was made of. And after running these tests, what they found was that this thing sitting in this display case for over 40 years wasn't a moon rock at all, but it was actually a piece of petrified wood. And since then, they've come out and said that they think it might have been an act of vandalization that caused this petrified wood to end up in the place of the actual moon rock. But then there's another side of it where they say that the moon rock on display was meant to be fake and that they have the actual moon rock stored in a separate facility. But whatever is going on, the moon rock that they pulled out of that display turned out to be petrified wood. And again, of course, all the moon rocks are not missing. NASA has quite a few in their possession, and they have an entire facility dedicated to the study of these moon rocks. Now, when scientists started to analyze these moon rocks, one of the things that they discovered when studying these rocks is that there was literally no difference between these moon rocks and Earth rocks because the composition of these rocks are so similar. They're pretty much composed of the same exact elements, and it's all elements that you can find on Earth. And so there was literally no way to tell the difference between these moon rocks and Earth rocks without doing some type of carbon dating on them to figure out how old they were, because they believed that the moon was formed 4.5 billion years ago. And so basically any rocks that carbon date back to that time frame are declared to be moon rocks. But even they admit it's one big guessing game because all of this is theoretical. They really don't have any idea of how the moon was actually formed. So because they really don't know how the moon was formed, they also really don't know when it was formed, meaning that there's no definitive way to know scientifically that these are really moon rocks. And essentially it's all based on theories and they're just guessing. But no matter which way it goes, they're essentially telling you all of these moon rocks are actually Earth rocks. But we know that the moon is one of the closest celestial objects to the Earth. Actually, it's the closest. And because the moon is so close, even with an amateur telescope, you can zoom into the moon and get some real close, detailed visuals of that celestial body in space. You can get some real vivid images of the craters and everything. But one thing an amateur telescope won't allow you to see is the equipment left on the Apollo sites from the Apollo missions. You know, no amateur telescope can zoom in that far. But if you could zoom in with a telescope and you could see these Apollo sites intact, if you could see the lunar lander and everything else left at the Apollo sites, that would end the argument. There'd be nothing left to talk about. But obviously an amateur telescope is not powerful enough to make that happen. But then you got to say, what about the Hubble telescope? Because we know the Hubble telescope is seeing things 10 to 15 billion light years away. So you would think that if any telescope could zoom into the moon and give us a clear shot of the Apollo landing sites in vivid detail, it would be the Hubble telescope. And in 2005, they did point the Hubble telescope toward the moon and they zoomed in to the landing sites for Apollo 15 and Apollo 17. And when they zoomed in, this is what they saw. And you can see the images are really warped and really pixelated. I mean, it's to the point where you really can't even tell what you're looking at with the Hubble telescope zoomed into these sites. And now when they zoomed out, you're able to see shadows of what they say is the equipment on these sites. But again, no clear, detailed, up close images of these landing sites. Definitely not the type of images you would expect from a telescope that's looking out at objects billions of light years away. You would think that a telescope with that type of capability should be able to easily zoom in and see these sites clearly. But according to NASA, it is impossible for the Hubble telescope to capture photos of the Apollo landing sites. They say that objects on a celestial body like the moon are just too small, and that even an object the size of a large house cannot be resolved by the Hubble telescope. So absolutely nothing that was left on the moon can be resolved into a Hubble image. They would just look blended and blotchy, just like the images that we see. So we can't see the flags, the tools, the television equipment, not even the lunar landers. None of these objects will properly resolve through Hubble. Hubble just can't handle the resolution of any of these objects. So then you say, okay, well, forget about Hubble. What about the James Webb telescope? Because the James Webb telescope is supposed to be 100 times more powerful than the Hubble telescope. I mean, this thing is supposed to be able to see a bumblebee on the Earth from as far back as the moon. So if any telescope could see the Apollo landing sites in any type of vivid detail, it should be the James Webb telescope. But when you look into it, they say there is no way that we could ever use the James Webb telescope to see the Apollo moon landing sites. They say that the temperature of the telescope combined with the angle at which the telescope is sitting makes it 100% impossible for us to ever see any objects on the moon with its telescope. So we can't see these sites through any telescopes. But then you might think, what about a rover? Because, you know, we could put a camera on the rover, send the rover into space to those specific landing sites on the moon and take pictures, just like we do with Mars. But there's just one problem. NASA has no rovers on the moon. They have not had any type of rover on the moon since Apollo 17. But of course, China has a rover on the moon. So you would think it would be as easy as China taking that rover, maneuvering it over to one of the Apollo landing sites and snapping a picture. That's how simple you would think it would be. Only one problem. All 6 Apollo landing sites are protected by U.S. law. So literally, they passed a bill that prevents any foreign companies and any private companies, anybody who is not NASA, from going anywhere near these sites. So legally, not only can China not send a rover to these sites, but not even a private owned company can. So let's say somebody had a lot of money and they wanted to build a space shuttle or a rover to send to the moon. If somebody was able to possibly independently find a way to make it to the moon, they would still be basically banned from going anywhere near these Apollo sites by law. So literally, there's no independent way to see these Apollo sites. The only way we can see these sites is through NASA. And NASA is saying there is no possible way to see these sites. So we've got no way of seeing the remnants of this miracle that took place over 50 years ago. And again, one of the things that makes this such a miracle is the fact that they made it past the Van Allen radiation belts before we even really understood what the belts were. But then the second miracle was just being able to create the technology to even be able to make it to the moon. Because you notice, again, we haven't been able to duplicate this in over 50 years. But you got to understand how all this started. We got to go back to 1945 when Hitler and the Nazis were basically seeking to dominate the world and starting that dominance with the entire continent of Europe. And they almost did it. They invaded and took over 11 countries in Europe. But of course, the United States steps in, joins the Allied powers against the Nazis, and the U.S. military invades Nazi Germany and pretty much wrecks shop on the Nazis, just destroys them. Hitler is pronounced dead. Nazi Germany waves the white flag in defeat, and World War II is over. But after this war, there was still a lot of Nazi war criminals. And among these war criminals, you also had a lot of Nazi scientists. And it didn't come out right away, but years later, it came out that the United States government took a lot of these scientists in. And instead of having them executed or put on trial for their war crimes, they actually recruited these scientists to work for the US government. And this whole recruitment process of these Nazi scientists was referred to as Operation Paperclip, because they would literally go through the files of each individual Nazi scientist. And if they saw one that they wanted to recruit, they would put a paperclip on their file. And one of the best scientists out of this bunch, one of Hitler's top rocket scientists, Werner von Braun, was brought in to help launch the United States conquest towards space and the development of a space agency that would eventually become NASA. And von Braun is considered so pivotal to aerospace and space exploration in general that they literally look at this man as the pioneer of rocket and space technology. And they literally call him the father of space travel. Because again, it wasn't until von Braun was recruited that we would eventually get the development of NASA. And what's interesting is just how quickly von Braun came in and was rubbing shoulders with like some of the most powerful people. You know, he's walking side by side with President Kennedy, and he's got this well-known friendship with Disney. But von Braun was allowed to come right in and to use his expertise as a rocket scientist to work out a way to get the United States into space. And von Braun's first target in space was the moon, working out a plan to get human beings onto the moon. And in 1955, just 6 years before Apollo, he presented this plan to the world. And when you look at this plan, it was quite a bit different than what we would eventually get with the Apollo missions.
Here to reveal a plan for a trip around the moon is the chief of the guided missile development at the United States Army's Redstone Arsenal, Dr. Werner von Braun.
A voyage around the moon must be made in 2 phases. A rocket ship taking off from the Earth's surface will use almost all the fuel it can carry just to attain a speed great enough to balance the pull of gravity. Unpowered, it will then keep circling the Earth in an orbit outside of the atmosphere. This is the first phase. However, if we can refuel the ship in this orbit with fuel brought up by cargo rocket ships, it can set out on the second phase, the trip around the moon and back. To facilitate this refueling operation, we will establish an advanced base in the orbit, 1,000 miles above the Earth. This advanced base, or space station, will be headquarters for the final ascent to the moon. Our space satellite will have the shape of a wheel, measuring 200 feet across. Its outside rim will contain living and working quarters for a crew of 50 men. The primary purpose of the first moon trip will be to test the methods and equipment to be used on later voyages into deep space. It will be essentially a scouting trip around the moon, and no landing will be attempted. Here we have a scale drawing of the Earth, with the moon 240,000 miles away. This is the elliptical path which our rocket ship will follow, going out and coming back. For the rocket to leave the orbit of the space station, its speed will have to be increased by firing the rocket for a brief period of 10 minutes. The ship will then coast for 5 days. The Earth's gravity begins to slow the rocket down until 121 hours later, at a point within 60 miles of the moon's surface, it will begin to fall back toward the Earth. Gradually picking up speed, it will take another 5 days to coast back to the space station. This model will show you how our future moon rocket ship might be designed. It will be 53 feet in length, has no wings or tail surfaces, because it will be assembled and operated only in the vacuum of space. To the nose, we have added a small atomic reactor, which will drive a steam turbine and furnish electricity for the ship's instruments. This shield will protect the crew members from dangerous radiation. The ship's crew of 4 men will be placed 2 in the front and 2 back here. Clustered around the rear of the ship are the 7 extra fuel tanks filled with hydrazine and nitric acid. Even though we now have the theoretical knowledge to make a trip to the moon, it will be many years yet before our plans can fully materialize. However, let us imagine for a moment that the many problems have been solved and that after completing our space station, we are ready to begin our first voyage around the moon.
So this original plan laid out by von Braun is like drastically different than what we would get with Apollo. The biggest difference being that von Braun's original assessment was that this whole trip to the moon would have to be done in 2 phases. That a rocket ship would have to use almost all of its fuel just to get up enough speed, just to make it into Earth orbit. And before this thing could even leave Earth orbit, it would have to be completely powered down and float in Earth orbit while they wait for even more rocket ships to be sent up to get the ship refueled. And to even facilitate that refueling process, we would first have to build a base or space station where that refueling process could actually take place. And then from there, the rocket ship would have to be fired up again from the space station on its way to the moon. And it was thought that just to guarantee that the rocket ship could make this full trip to the moon and back, that this rocket ship would need at least 7 extra fuel tanks. But of course, we know, number one, that base or the space station wasn't launched until 1998, over 30 years after Apollo. So when Apollo took off, it had no base or no space station. And again, it took us 30 years after Apollo to even bring that vision of a space station into existence. And remember, this space station was the foundation of this original plan of how we would be able to make it to the moon. Remember, you got von Braun heavily emphasizing the importance of first having this space station before we could even think about going to the moon. So having that space station makes up a huge bulk of how he even saw this trip to the moon being something that was even attainable. But again, this is where the miraculous nature of this historical trip to the moon by Apollo comes in, because they did all of this over 6 times back to back without the need of a space station, cargo ships, pretty much anything and everything that von Braun had originally hypothesized that they would need. All they needed was that Saturn V rocket to get them to the moon and back, because the Saturn V rocket gave you all 3 phases in one. No need for a base, no need for extra fuel tanks. This rocket was so powerful that it could literally jettison itself out of Earth orbit with just those 5 J2 engines in the second stage. So as soon as the rocket pushed into Earth's atmosphere and made it into Earth orbit, those different stages would kick in. The command module made that separation, made that 180-degree turn, and docked with the lunar module. Then the command module and the lunar module combined together, separated from Saturn V, and shot off on that 250,000 mile journey toward the moon. Then when they finally made it to the moon, the command module separated from the lunar module again while in orbit. And this is when the command module became Columbia, while the lunar module became Eagle. And Columbia stays in orbit while the Eagle lands and makes that slow and steady and precise descent to the moon. We get that historic moonwalk, and then the lunar module partially breaks away and ascends back into orbit and makes that calculated 180-degree docking with the command module again. The astronauts move from the lunar module to the command module. The lunar module is detached and sent down to its final descent to the moon, and the command module rockets back on that final 150,000 mile journey back to Earth. Half of the command module gets ejected just before they get to the Earth, and what's left of that command module splashes down into the ocean, and the Apollo astronauts arrive safely back on the Earth. And again, they did all this essentially with just one transformative craft, and no base, no space station, no cargo ships, just the Saturn V rocket. And they pulled this thing off 6 times near flawlessly with just that Saturn V rocket. And you got to understand, this Saturn V rocket was so advanced that it is literally the only rocket that has ever made it beyond Earth orbit. And again, all they needed to make 6 successful trips to the moon was this one rocket, completely overpassing von Braun's original assessment of how this would have worked. And remember, von Braun made this assessment in 1955. And it took another 3 years after that for the Van Allen radiation belts to be discovered. So one of the biggest factors wasn't even included in his assessment. But we already know, in order to make that trajectory towards the moon the way they did, they would have had to have gone through those belts. And the ultimate question is, how did they do it? How did they make it through the belts? And how did they fuel and operate all of this technology? Well, we know they lost all of the equipment and all of the subsequent data that went with that, which could have given us a clear explanation of how they did this. But remember, you still had mission control on the ground, on the Earth, recording all the telemetry data of each and every Apollo mission. And that telemetry data would be a record of everything we would need to know about how they managed to make this work. Because that telemetry data is going to give us everything from every little measurement of the course that they took to the moon and back, down to the heart rate of the astronauts inside the module. But unfortunately, when you look into it, NASA cannot find the telemetry data. So literally, just like so many other things dealing with Apollo, the telemetry data for the Apollo missions recorded by Mission Control is missing.
This is Johnson Space Center, home to Mission Control. It's time to try and find legendary flight director Gene Kranz.
Smile. FAO. Don't be mad. We'll get it up there. See how nice and leisurely it's been? That's the way it should be.
Everything that was happening aboard the Apollo 11 flight was constantly streaming down to antenna sites all over the world. From the astronauts' heartbeats to electrical use inside the command module, it was all recorded on these telemetry tapes.
There is no question in any real engineers, program managers, flight planners, or astronauts' mind that this was the real thing.
Roger, and for your information, we show you at an altitude of about 92 miles above the surface right now.
I haven't seen anything that indicates the telemetry data is even in existence, and as I said, even if we had it, we don't have the machines to play it back.
But your own research has shown the telemetry data is missing.
That's right.
This is Houston, radio check, over.
If it's anywhere, it should be here at NASA's Goddard Space Center in Maryland, home to the National Space Science Data Archives.
Doesn't have it either. The Smithsonian doesn't have it. Johnson doesn't have it.
Right. We've been unable to track it down. I mean, we don't know where this telemetry data ended up, and we don't know what path it may have taken. So, unfortunately, I'm afraid I can't really give you much of a clue as to where this data ended up and whether it still exists or not.